here's his logic. He says, how can a God judge us for the decisions that we make in this world line when there are infinite other world lines and infinite copies of myself making different decisions in different parallel universes? And he says that wouldn't be fair.
Right. That's
just not fair. And that's his way of sort of deflecting or rejecting the idea of a God that judges, a God that actually is good in a sense, with a pure sense of justice that will redeem and things like that. So,
right. It's such a tired argument, I think. It just, in my opinion, it's not fair. Like, God's not fair. How could he do that? Like a logical fairness. People look for a logical fairness. That doesn't need to be the case. You know what I mean? They assume that there needs to be this logical fairness when they're talking about things like multiple universes and world lines. And they're saying, oh, well, because there's multiple world lines and because there's infinite parallel universes, God can't judge me. What? It's just, okay, anyways. But at the same time, John Titor himself says, besides the process of time traveling, you really shouldn't be worrying about other world lines. So at the same time, John Titor himself says, yeah, well, you should, don't take this multiple world line thing as, any, don't change your life because of this.
Right.
You still have to live in your world line, so do it. And,
Well, and it's kind of an interesting point you bring up, because my response to this guy and his whole thing is that, God is in control of time, and we can only prove that our timeline exists, and therefore, we should be, again, sort of like how John Titor said, we are only responsible for our timeline here. And, if you want to really get into it, in this timeline, allegedly, and I believe it to be true, is the timeline where Jesus Christ died and rose again for our sins. So, you know what I mean? It's hey, maybe in a different timeline, something different happened, but
right. And it gets very complicated, and we'll get further into that, because he even mentions how in some cases you will travel to a timeline that Jesus Christ was never even born or something, or that's a possibility or something.
Right.
Because there's an infinite number of them. Every situation exists, including one where Jesus did not come down to the earth. But I guess that's just sort of a side point. I like how we're talking about these world lines now as if they're real.
Those are real, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, just a disclaimer. We're talking about these world lines. We don't necessarily think they're real. It's just what we're talking about now.
On a theoretical basis. It's sort of, I think we're just trying to address the points that not necessarily attack or try to break down the traditional, I guess, theistic or Christian worldview.
Right. Well, and I kind of wanted to talk about this whole God's not fair thing again, because I just had an experience online. Whoa, imagine that, where this guy was talking about, it was a good versus evil argument, how can there be his whole thing was, why did God even give us free will if he just knew that we were going to mess it up? And it's not fair. He set us up for failure. It's entrapment. It's shut your mouth, please. It just doesn't. It just comes from this. I don't know. I like to call it whiny. It comes from a very whiny theological perspective.
Well, yeah.
And the second you explain to them, look, the only rule that there was in the beginning was don't eat this fruit, please. Can you please not do that? There's nothing good coming out of it. But, in order for free will to be a thing, I guess there needs to be something to provide a physical artifact of love towards God, which is not eating from this fruit.
Right.
You know what I mean? So, I mean, if there is nothing to be done wrong, free will does not exist. So, I mean, just logically, and these people love logic. So logically, there has to be something that you can't do. And so, when you do it, you're not simply just like, oh, I fell into God's trap of unfairness and ate from this tree. It's no, you spit in his eye and told him you didn't need him anymore because now you know the difference between good and evil and you can be like gods. So,
right.
So la-di-da, I'm going to take off with this serpent and thanks for the apple, God.
Right. And even on a different level too, the concept of just suffering in general, because that is a huge topic that people bring up in opposition to a Christian God,
Right.
It's this whole idea of we come from innocence, and a lot of, again, in the Garden of Eden before the fall, humans were innocent beings effectively. We didn't really know sin. I guess we might have had knowledge of it, but we didn't really experience it in the fullest that we do now. And a lot of people talk about how, God is going to restore us to that innocence. And I disagree with that. I actually think that a redeemed world is far better than an innocent world. And I think that's why there is this sort of fallout, is because how are we otherwise supposed to develop characteristics like patience or wisdom or, these things don't come about just being innocent. You have to sort of go through a time of molding or shaping to get to that point. And so in that sense, the ultimate plan that God has is way bigger and way more glorious than we can ever imagine. And it's just, it comes from a really selfish place, I think, to try to bring the justice argument in, because you're basically saying by bringing that argument up, you're basically saying I am God because I determine what is good and wrong and bad.
Right. And exactly, that's the point is I say, oh, these people think God's not fair. I don't say that to say God isn't fair, get used to it. I'm saying that you're working in such a narrow mindset to think that God is not fair in things that he has done. You're looking at fairness at such an infantile, juvenile level, especially when you start talking about things like the Garden of Eden and how God entrapped us into sinning and things like that.
Well,
and it's just ridiculous.
The funniest thing I think is that these folks that bring that argument up and everything that surrounds it, saying, oh, there was, God is the evil God, Yahweh is evil. And it pushes into the Luciferic doctrine, which is that Lucifer is the good guy. He freed us from the garden with knowledge. And, we were no longer slaves to this Yahweh character. And so
who gave us rules and, it didn't want us to eat apples.
Who didn't want us to have knowledge. And so, again, it's very interesting how even those who have no idea that they are preaching the Luciferic doctrine are.
Right. Well, and that's one thing. Now, this might diverge a little bit, but I think that's what gives the whole story so much awesomeness and truth. And it just shows me that, like, hey, this is actually the real deal, which is that it can be manipulated that way. And it is manipulated that way.
Are you talking about?
I'm talking about the Luciferian branch off of the, the beginning of mankind.
Okay.
And where here's this story of, God creates us. He walks around with us. We are in perfect communion with him, and we are all so happy. There's this one thing, don't eat that, but let's all just live together in peace and harmony. And then the fact that it is twisted to the Luciferian doctrine of Lucifer coming in, enlightening us, and and giving us knowledge because he is a fair God and he wants what's best for, the human race and things. The fact that that's even a thing, I mean, what other doctrine has that? I mean, is there a Muslim doctrine where there's like a separate Muslim Luciferian doctrine off of that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think there's some old Sumerian texts, and I've come across people recently that have really pushed this like, well, the Sumerian doctrines are older than the Bible, therefore it must be true. And that's not necessarily the case either. But, there's stories of the two gods, Enki and Lil,